I'm Robert Rosenberg, the director of the Coral Gables Art Cinema right across the street, and we are co-sponsoring this panel with Florida International University's Center for the Humanities and Urban Environments, and of course, Books in Books, where we are. Just a little plug, with the reason we're having this panel this week is because it's concurrent with our run of the wonderful French film Rust and Bone, which will be playing there for one more week, up until February 7th, and obviously that film does include some scenes of violence, which is why we decided to have this panel at this time. So if you haven't ever been over to the theater or you haven't seen the film yet, please feel free to visit us and come see the movie. Without further ado, I want to introduce the moderator of the panel. Oh, wait, also over there, Danny Diaz. Danny, raise your hand. And Javier, I can't get people's last names right. Chavez over there, who work at the theater, are standing over there. If you're on your way out, if you want to sign up on our mailing list, if you're not on our mailing list, or pick up some information about the cinema, please do. So the moderator of tonight's panel is Michael Patrick Gillespie, Professor of English and Director of the Center for Humanities in an Urban Environment at FIU, and I'm going to give it to Michael to take over.
Thanks very much, Robert. No, I don't rate a microphone. It's only for the real panelists. Before we begin, I'd like to take a few minutes to thank a number of people who have made this evening possible and make other subsequent events in the center possible as well. The first time I did this was a year and a half ago at FIU when we did a screening of the Channel 2, the documentary Private Lives, and then had a talk back with Arthur Parks and Dorothy Fields. And I began with thanking everyone that was responsible, and I tried not to leave out anyone. And on the way home, I said to my wife in the car, well, what did you think of it? She said it was very nice. I said, well, what did you think of my thanking everyone? And she said, well, it was fine, but I think you were longer than the film. So I promised not to go beyond the panel's allotted time tonight. But I would be remiss if I didn't begin by thanking Mitchell Kaplan and the entire staff at Books and Books for their hospitality, and Robert Rosenberg and the staff of Coral Gables Art Cinema. Were it not for Robert and his energy, I don't think the panel it certainly wouldn't be in its present form, and it may not have come into existence at all. I'm deeply grateful to him for his generosity and for his energy, as I am to all the panelists. We have I think a wonderfully eclectic and wonderfully distinguished group of panelists that are here tonight, and I'm very interested, very excited to hear what they have to say and then what you have to say afterwards. I also want to thank WPBT Channel 2, which records all of our center presentations and has again been a very strong supporter of the center from the inception, and Professor Asher Milbauer and the Exile Studies Program, co-sponsor of all our events, and someone who has given me the guidance and the wisdom and the patience that I lack in all three areas, and so I'm profoundly grateful to him. And finally, to the FIU Alumni Association, which is steadfast in promoting all of our events. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to break for a brief commercial message to talk about a series of subsequent events that we're having through the center. On February 6th at FIU, Helen Ferre will talk at 7 o'clock in the Green Library on the relation of humanities to the public sphere. On February 11th, Monday, February 11th, in the Graham Center, we're very fortunate to have Edwidge Danicott to talk about the perspective of the exilic writer. On February 13th, what better way to prepare for Valentine's Day than to go to a panel discussion on the business of medicine here at the Coral Gables Museum. There will be a number of very, very distinguished educators, health caregivers, and a senior president from Blue Cross Blue Shield. And finally, at the end of the month, on February 25th at FIU, Dr. Leon Botstein, the president of Bard College, noted composer and conductor, will talk about the role of the university and patronage in terms of the exile. So it's a very full February for us. If you have any interest in any of the events, please don't hesitate to sign up on our mailing list. I'll be sure that you're kept abreast of everything. Tonight, as I said, we have a wonderful group of panelists. Philip Church from the theater department at FIU, Lucas Leva, an independent filmmaker and a pioneering filmmaker here in Miami, Robert Rosenberg, who, as I said, directs the Coral Gables Art Cinema, and Barbara White, who directs the film studies program at FIU. I gave each of them a homework assignment, asking them to talk about different topics for 5 to 7 minutes. That will take about the first half hour of the evening, and then for the remainder, we'll have a discussion with you and the panelists. This is similar to a format that we followed in the fall at the Gables stage on the topic of representation of violence in the theater. It worked very well there. I think it's going to work extremely well tonight. Philip Church will begin the discussion and talk about the artistic value. The artistic value of violence in film. Philip?
Yeah, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd kind of sooner not use the microphone if that's all right with you, as long as you can all hear. Anybody okay? Anybody? Yeah. Forgive me for having written. We academics tend to wander and get off point. So rather than that, keep to a through line on some thoughts here as a director and also as a member of the general public as well, which we directors have to bear in mind when we're directing and producing theater or film. It is perhaps ironic that as one who avoids attending films with violent content, and having just written and directed a docudrama based on Holocaust history, and facing the question of how exactly I am going to go about staging the assassination of the Emperor Caesar in a production of Julius Caesar a year from now, I am asked to address a question concerning the value of violence in my work as a director. Staging violence in theater offers a totally different challenge from that in film, and can often result in totally different responses in an audience. The fact that a live theater audience is constantly reminded of the artifice of the illusion, the lights, the proscenium arch, the makeup, the totality of the actor's body and those of other actors constantly viewed in one frame, the fact that the audience is able to watch the dead body up close and personal for the entire time that the body lays prone on the floor, and will readily forgive the actor if the intercostal muscles around the stomach area that control the diaphragm and therefore the breathing apparatus are seen to rise and fall. The fact that a live theater audience is ready to suspend its disbelief, because that is how it has been conditioned for 2,000 years, is what differentiates theater from film when it comes to the use and the truth of violence. Everyone knows that the actor/character is not really dead in the theater. However, if a certain subset of emotional truths have been successfully employed prior to the death, the audience will accept the death as real, regardless of the noticeable inhalation and exhalation of the dead corpse. I preface my remarks by starting out with an observation from theatre, because film is not so forgiving when it comes to the suspension of disbelief. Death must look like death, up close and personal, and the motive for killing and the hatred beneath the motive must be utterly convincing. And let's be honest, there seems to be an escalating propensity toward hatred in movies today. I refer to, most specifically, to the recently released film Zero Dark 30 as just one example. The real-life sound bites of anguished and terrified people trapped in the exploding Twin Towers prior to the film's first brutal torture scene successfully preps the audience in recalling the horror of 9/11, possibly positioning them back into a state of, I'm going to say hatred, but I don't actually mean that will then have them become concomitants with the pro-justice protagonists. It is interesting that the film opened just prior to the public trials of jail terrorists at Guantanamo Bay. The issue of how and when a film is timed to open will be touched on later. Violence in film. What value has violence for you as a director? That's my topic. I might venture to say that perhaps each panelist on this forum has been compromised to some extent by the question they have been assigned to address. What I allude to is the artist's awareness of a disturbing escalation of violence on the streets and in its cultural entertainment, and as a consequence, the nation's soul-searching preoccupation with gun control. I don't know how any of us can really begin to dignify violence as an art form, and yet, if we are to be honest about our own industry, this is what we do each time we place violence center stage. Was it always this way? If the deaths at Sandy Hook Elementary, Aurora, Colorado, Columbine, Virginia Tech mean anything at all, how can we find artistic value and opportunity in violence? How can we sign off on retribution and revenge killings as a way of entertaining or educating the public? The principle of an eye for an eye may have a biblical root and may satisfy those seeking ultimate justice, but as a form of entertainment, one thinks little of this when the real child is blown away from its real parent in real life. To the artists, the decision to incorporate violence in film, theater, or any art form should be the most compromising of questions. The artist is, after all, called upon to reflect the truth and the reality of the world around him or her, to hold a mirror up to nature, as Hamlet reminds the troupe of actors who he hires to expose the guilt of his father's murderer. The artist is called upon to reflect and interpret life as society sees it, as the artist sees it, the reality, the truth of what really happens in life. Violence is, after all, a great part of life's total experience, the birthing process being one of the most violent of acts. Yet the emerging baby has no conscious plan to make the mother suffer. The force of nature is not a blatant form of aggression. Neither are the catastrophic disasters that we endure, often feeling them as a personal affliction against us. They are no such thing. Nature does not intentionally wreak havoc against mankind, but rather seeks to restore its energy, bringing the natural world into a better sense of order and balance. Is this our intention when we stream violent behavior across our streets, the screens, in our video games, in our criminal justice series that seem to compete on a daily basis for different ways to design murder and homicide, in our talk shows that wreak havoc in the lives of people who only seek to find ways of putting themselves together, to feel a voyeuristic hunger, our films that contain envelope-pushing situations, cruelty, and language, films that often take years of planning and production, being produced for the greater good of mankind, to bring balance and harmony back into an otherwise discordant and divided world. I am just trying to find out what our fascination with violence is, and I am also asking the question of what value violence has for me as a director. So, I am probably not the right person to ask to talk about the value of violence in film or in any other art form, and while I have directed such plays containing violent themes as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Dead Man Walking, Death and the Maiden, as a director, I have not gone out of my way to find material in which horror and cruelty take center stage. It is true that mutilation, desecration and gore litter Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, yet we should remember these acts of violence in the drama were reported by witnesses. They were descriptive monologues. The role of the messenger had an essential function back then. In one of the most bloodthirsty of ages, 400 years ago, graphic and visual violence was, for the most part, barred from view. It took the Jacobeans who followed Elizabeth to unleash the spectacle of violence, and thus began the plundering of the audience's imagination. 400 years later, little is left to the imagination. Video games allow us to become the protagonist, armed with the latest assault rifle, enable us to become the Navy SEAL rooting out Osama bin Laden. We can rent or buy the opportunity to kill him at point-blank range, high-fiving our fearless victory and thinking ourselves fictional heroes for having saved the world from the ultimate evil force. However, the film Zero Dark 30 has opened, sharing its convincing realism with scenes of brutal waterboarding, racial humiliation, and profane language, yet, with the leader killed, terrorism continues to spiral out of control. So what point exactly is the film making? To those of you who have studied theatre history, or have read Greek drama, one of the necessary 6 Aristotelian elements of drama is conflict. However, I do not recall him calling for violence, but presumably all conflict leads ultimately to violence. So I suppose Aristotle means violence when he named the element conflict. Today, few play scripts or screenplays eschew violence in some form or another. Even comedies receive their fair share. The issue is not whether violence exists, but at what level one is prepared to elevate it as an art form. And we know for a fact that violence can be a persuasive lure for investment. It is pertinent to note that, according to the Miami Herald, in the second week after its opening, Zero Dark 30 took in, from cinemas across the country, $17.5 million, while the revenue from its international sales reflected less than $1 million. As a director and instructor of young actors for over 40 years, I feel it incumbent to make sure they first practice self-respect, then respect for others, so they may arrive at finding respect for the characters they play. These actors will certainly be challenged throughout their careers with having to play disreputable, ambitious, and corrupt characters. Yet, the actor who first discovers self-respect and respect for others will always find the respect needed to play marginal characters. One can only hope that the level of humanity that an actor brings to each and every role will provide some kind of vindication to those films and plays that seem hell-bent on promoting hatred and revenge. One either values life or one does not. What kind of value lies in the title, A Bullet to the Head? A film that is soon to open at area theatres across the country. These are choices that artists make. There has to be accountability at some point. Whose idea was it to open what has been dubbed as Tarantino's most brutal film to date, Durango Unchained, on Christmas night and just days after the killings at Sandy Hook? What message was the studio sending by choosing that particular night to open a graphically violent film? The majority of the audience is not made up of people like ourselves here present tonight, who come to Books and Books to analyze and debate the moral value of violence. For them, it is pure entertainment, and they want to see just how far we can push the envelope. My question is, are we, as directors, performers, producers, distributors, not accountable at some point for any of what happens in life? Do we not recognize the effects, positive and negative, of our work on the world? Where is the positive in violence? And finally, if indeed films of violence are made with the intention to teach us something about the real world and how it really is, then perhaps every violent film should also contain an epilogue focusing on the unbearable pain borne by the relatives of those characters who remain behind. That is where action film parts ways with real life. But if you asked someone who had lost a loved one to a shooting or domestic violence or human trafficking, I doubt very much if they would want to see the heroics of revenge represented by any form of entertainment. One would hope that they would want to see a world that begged possibility and change. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for those very detailed observations. Lucas, would you talk about violence from the perspective of a filmmaker?
I'm going to use a mic. I'm a little sick. So I'm not an academic. I'm a filmmaker and producer, and I frankly don't spend that much time thinking about these things. I spend more of my time making the things, if not making something, in the process of preparing to make something. And honestly, in this last year, I produced 16 short films, and the last year I did like 30 short projects. And in all of them, we never had a discussion where we really considered, like, oh, were the ramifications of this violence or not having violence or that. We were just kind of trying to serve the story and serve the idea that the director was trying to put forward. I guess once I started thinking about whether or not, I mean, we don't make, to be clear, we're making small independent projects, so they're not going to be seen by the masses at any point. Some of them have gotten a lot of attention on YouTube, but it's like not, sort of mainstream entertainment. So we're able to do, I guess, we feel like it's more of a playground where like the ramifications aren't as big. But, and I spoke to some of the filmmakers I had worked with when this topic came up, and I guess, and I don't know if this is irresponsible or some people may call it that, but it's really not, they don't feel like they're not parents. We're not parents, we're not teachers, we're artists. We are trying to express something, and the idea is that if there is some violence in that artwork, it's because it's an expression of the artist that's making it, and therefore will connect with someone else. It's not our place to put it in context. We're creating entertainment and artwork. That's the place of society and of parents and of teachers and other figures of guidance. But violence is, in humans, I think, is pervasive and intrinsic. If it's not, if it's not violent video games, it's violent films, and if it's not that, it's the Coliseum. If it's not the Coliseum, it's football, and if it's not like that, it's bear baiting. Like, we are terribly violent creatures, and and there's something that draws us to that, and it goes back to beyond. It's even pre-human. I recently met a primatologist that was making a film about basically monkey TV, like television for chimpanzees, and no one had ever done a comprehensive study about like what do chimpanzees like to watch on television, what entertains them, and they found, surprise, that they love violence and porn. I think that the same can be said for most humans, even the ones that come to books and sit around the moralistic implications of a Tarantino film. But yeah, and I think, I personally love violence. I think it's very entertaining, and I don't know if that makes me a chimpanzee or I don't know, and a lot of times like that's where our work comes from. And I'll end really quickly because, but I'll talk about the one incident where, probably the most violent incident in the film that we made. It was a film called Cockfight, and it was a short film by a local filmmaker named Julian Yuri Rodriguez, and it took place in this underground fighting ring, bath salt fuel, just like, the grimiest Miami place you can imagine. And it was kind of this film, and at the end, it's a fighting ring, and at the end there's a man gets killed and raped as a crowd of men cheer on. And that film, we made a choice that was kind of controversial, like as we were editing it, to put a really beautiful piece of music to that violent scene. We cut out the sound. Like up until that point, the sounds had been like dark and boom boom. But in that moment, the filmmaker and so we decided to cut out the sound and put really beautiful string music, and it kind of like brought the film from a place we thought of just like, look how intense, look how much we can push it, to sort of making us question like, who are these men that are cheering on for this rape and violence, and are we who are sitting in the audience potentially entertained by this? What sort of bringing up the same questions. So I can't answer this question, but the best sort of I can do as an artist and as someone who helps facilitate the creation of artwork is sort of ask the questions of ourselves, and hopefully more and more people will think about that while watching what is ultimately entertainment.
Thank you very much, Lucas. I don't think any of us will think of chimpanzees in the same way ever again. Robert, would you talk about marketing, distributing, presenting violent films?
We're the infirmary over here. I have a cold too, so I'm gonna use the mic. When thinking about this panel, I thought about 4 different kinds of violence that you see in films, and only some of which really apply to the kind of films we show at the cinema. I think it's important to separate them. First, realistic things that can happen to anybody: car accidents, muggings, anything that falls into accidents, death, something mentioned birth. Those can be very violent and very violently depicted things in films. I think most of the films that we show that have violent elements really are included in that. Even Rust and Bone, which is a little bit hyper-realistic, most of the things that happen in there are not actually that extreme. So I think in those films, those kinds of violent incidents really are part of the storytelling. They're much more easily justifiable, so I'm going to put those aside for a second. The second kind of violence, which I think people haven't spoken about too much, is what I call psychological violence. Films of suspense or thrillers where there's that kind of always that chance something terrible is going to happen, or the terrible things that do happen, while they may be small, are so extreme or transgressive that they're very disturbing. I think The Skin I Live In, the recent Almodovar film that we showed, very much falls into that. There's not that much violence in it, but it's pretty transgressive if you've seen it, and it definitely feels like threatening and disturbing. And some of our art house films definitely fall more into that as well. I think the 2 other categories of violence are really the 2 categories that get people in trouble or get people concerned about what's on the big screen or the little screen or wherever you see it, which is, one, depictions of very extreme real-life events, whether they're mass shootings or, in the case of Zero Dark 30, of the war on terrorism, that we don't necessarily, most of us, get to see close up. And when you, as Philip said, in a film, you can see very realistically portrayed situations and experiences that are very disturbing to be part of, whether it's a 9/11 attack or the war on terrorism. Most of those films don't fall into the art house category. Occasionally they do, or some films like Zero Dark 30, which have gotten a lot of critical acclaim as works of art, but are actually mass market films. And then the 4th category, which is of course the most problematic, are films, whether it's in the art kind of category of Tarantino or other kinds of genre films, where there's so much violence and it's so extreme that it reaches cartoonish levels. Most video games are like that. Those are films in a genre category where people have the most issue with what those films are doing on the screen, what's their purpose, who do they serve, what effect do they have on society. We've shown very, very few of those. We did show a film from South Korea called I Saw the Devil, which is an amazing film that I had to watch when I watched it at home on a DVD first, with my hands over my eyes. I don't usually watch films that are that violent. Those are really, it was like a serial killer, but a really, really violent serial killer film. So I think we have to distinguish which kinds of violence we're talking about. And when I thought about these categories and the debate over violence, it reminded me of the now like 30-year-old debate in the sort of post-feminist era that we're in about pornography versus erotica. It really falls into the same kind of categories of whether a film to you is gratuitous violence or it's violence that's part of telling the story or good entertainment. So in sex, it's the same thing. One person's pornography is another person's erotica, and vice versa. In general, I'm a total First Amendment person and think artists should make, as Lucas said, whatever films they feel like making. I'm pretty much prefer to show the films that I think are great on our screen. If they include violence, so be it. But you have to think about the audience and how the audience is going to respond. I think it's intriguing, Rust and Bone being a great example. For us, I think people come to see art films in an art house context. They're not usually looking for genre films like a lot of what gets made in the Borscht short films, or even Tarantino sort of like, like transmutation of the genre film and the kind of things he makes. They're looking for deep dramas, great comedies, big romances, and a film like Rust and Bone, which, how many of you have seen Rust and Bone? Anybody see here? Okay, enough of you know what I won't get read the story, but Rust and Bone, as a friend of mine said, a female friend said, it's essentially a chick flick with romance and resolution, and yet it's full of more violence than you'd expect in a chick flick. And I think what that does for our audience is you get people coming wanting to see this wonderful French film with Marion Cotillard who won the Oscar for La Vie en Rose, and it's going to be wonderful, and then they're like startled to see small moments of brutality. It's not constant. We've had people walk out on that film repeatedly, not the whole audience, but every time people walk out, various points, always the same points, and I find it fascinating because, of course, if they went to see Django Unchained, it's like 1,000 times more violent. So I think people's expectations of what they're going to see really changes how they perceive violence. I think it's interesting for me, programming the theater, violence and sex are the two things that become the lightning rods, as we talked about the chimpanzees and pornography and extreme violence. I think that you've got to separate out what's entertainment and what's art, another impossible distinction to make. But I have no problem that there are violent films that entertain people. Obviously, it's like sort of a roller coaster ride. The same thing with sex. I try to choose films for the art theater that have artistic value, but it would be silly to deny that films that are strong and extreme, whether it's violent or sex, are also amusing and entertaining, and it's part of the pleasure of seeing them. I just, want to leave you, though, with, of course, in this era where there seems to be a mass killing almost every month. I mean, even some of the time that we scheduled this, there's been a couple of mass killings and mass shootings. You have to begin to question what is the connection between these films and what we show, what you see on TV, just in news coverage. What are the limitations of what we should be screening, and what are the limitations on our responsibilities? I don't think that's an easy answer to give. I think looking back at the era of Hitchcock and older films where suspense and thrillers, everything was more suggested, it was easier to say, even with a film like Psycho, which kind of began to break those barriers, that it was easier to accept those depictions. And now what we see on screen where there's no limitations, it's a little bit tougher to decide.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. I think the idea of pornography is a very good benchmark against which to measure violence, and the subjectivity of our response is an excellent point. I'm sure we'll come back to it. But first, Barbara, could you talk a bit about how representations of violence in the film unfold in a classroom setting?
Okay, well, first of all, I just have to say this. I was horrified when I saw Philip with this beautifully written out text. You got to see my notes. Okay. And they were done on an airplane coming home from the Sundance Film Festival Sunday night. So there was some context to that. But one thing that always interests me, and something that I, as a professor, as an educator, I love to show violent films. And I hate violent films. But the reason I love to show them is because the classroom setting, especially in university, the purpose of the classroom is to contextualize that violence or that particular film, to be able to show a film and discuss it, have the students learn how to critically look at a film, how to understand a film as a text, which they're not taught to do in our current entertainment industry, and certainly in the Hollywood film industry. When I was thinking about it before, I was thinking about kind of the dichotomy or the contrast. Most of you, I imagine, the people who would come here, know the quotation by Chekhov, Anton Chekhov, who said, if you introduce a film in the first, if you introduce a gun in the first scene, it had better go off by the end, okay? And I was thinking, how does that relate to Hollywood, which is the way most people digest films these days? And my thought was, well, Hollywood feels if you don't introduce guns at all, then you've totally lost the box office, therefore their purpose of the film itself. And I think that this has to be understood, that to Hollywood, what drives content is demand. It's not really an artistic sensibility that Robert or even Philip was talking about, or Lucas was talking about. It's a business. And the demand is going to be what can make the most money for the filmmakers, or for Hollywood. With that said, what I love to do in the classroom, by showing a very violent film or a film that students don't expect to see in a classroom, is to then be able to upset their expectations, okay? To teach them new ways of looking at these particular films. I'm just going to give you one anecdote, which is something that horrifies me, and it always has horrified me. I love to use the film Taxi Driver, if you remember the 1976 Martin Scorsese film. Yeah. I'll show that, and I'll ask students, what is the most horrifying part of this film, or the most horrifying scene? Bar none, they all give me the same answer. The scene before the last one, in which Robert De Niro literally blows away half the city of New York in this apartment building, and blood spatters on the wall, and this is back in the 70s. And my answer is always, well, what do you think about the last scene? And students go, oh, that was so uplifting. How wonderful that he was regarded as a hero. If you don't remember the film, the last scene just juxtaposes this violence, this graphic violence, with Robert De Niro walking around the living room of his apartment, where he's got taped onto the wall all these letters from different people in New York thanking him for saving this young girl, Jodie Foster, prostitute, and getting rid of the bad guys. Meanwhile, if you had seen the entire film, you'd know that Robert De Niro is not a good guy. He's not a hero by any stretch of the imagination. And he was simply externalizing this inner violence that he felt. Goes back to the Vietnam War and, all of this. But the whole idea, to me, that is by far the most violent scene of the film, because suddenly it's okay if it's done with some more, I don't even want to use the word moral because we've used that so much, some justification, okay, which again is that these were bad guys and they were holding this girl again, not against her will, but she was too young to realize. And suddenly you elevate him to the status of hero. To me, that is very, very unsettling. And I try to make my students see these types of things. I can't wait till Django Unchained goes to DVD or streaming or however I'm going to be able to show it in the classroom. Because I want to make sure that the students understand that Tarantino understands the harshness and the reality of violence in the United States today. And he's playing on that. It's a cartoon, in a sense. Violence, to him, is a cartoon. Really taking it to that extreme, blowing everyone away, is giving it a different sensibility. But I'm not so sure students really understand that. And again, I feel the responsibility that it's up to me in the classroom to be able to lead them to the meanings behind the violence that is shown, not to take away the violence that is shown. Another thought I had, again, because I have all of these individual thoughts, is how amazing it is that we as a society are fascinated by what should horrify us. And this, again, is what drives commercial cinema. And it's something that needs to be understood. What I had planned to really talk about, which I won't, I was going to get on my soapbox and talk about the need for gun control in America today. And how interesting and timely this particular panel is in light of what's been happening over the last couple of months in terms of that. But that would come up I'm not afraid to confront that in a classroom. And that would come up in any discussion I would have that related to that. Why are AK-47s readily available? And why is that okay? And why I spend a lot of time in Europe, and I teach there in the summertime, and it's so interesting that I'd say 90% at least of the screens, the multiplexes in any European city shows American films and shows American commercial films. So why is it that Europeans and people in other places of the world see the same films that we see, that many people say touches off the violence that we've seen in Sandy Hook or in Aurora, Colorado, yet they don't react with guns. They don't pick up AK-47s that are so accessible here and blow people away. And you've got to ask that question too. You know, is it our society? And if so, I feel I have a responsibility to address that in the types of violent films that are shown.
Thank you very much.